Humility, equity, anti-racism, lateral kindness, inclusivity, and trauma-informed, these are key aspects that we as a collective are asked to bring into our everyday lives, our work lives, so we can share space with each other, with humility, with kindness. I'm so excited to bring in amazing voices, social change leaders in the Prince George area, so that together we can hear about why it matters, what got them interested in what they represent in the community, and maybe even some tips for other leaders in the community of how to best serve all people. I'm really looking forward to this journey together. Welcome to another episode of Hope and Healing in the North with your host, Auroara Leigh. Today we are discussing inclusivity with Misia Slugocki. And you will see that societal values are something that keep being inclusive in inclusivity. It is so important to look at what values we hold when we are looking at other people, ourselves, society, groups, which way we're moving forward. You will see that societal values are a continual theme, and I really hope that you enjoy this episode.
I'm Misia Slugocki. I am I would say a pretty advocate of mental health and addictions in all forms. I have been in this line of work for 15-ish years now. And
what line of work?
So I guess I started off in nursing in Alberta and then ended up here back in Prince George and kind of working with youth and then it kind of progressed into adults with mental health and addiction issues, and kind of the catalyst of homelessness that has progressed from that and kind of the issues that I see within the system. So
the issues that you see that impact like homeless.
Yeah, so just in general, right? There's that stigma around mental health and addictions and homelessness, right? That people choose that path, and it's really a fairly false narrative, right? It's kind of stems down from as we've kind of learned more about kind of the neuroscience behind addictions and mental health and how that progression, especially with intergenerational traumas, and kind of how that affects individuals on a day-to-day basis.
It's hard for people to prosper in a system that's designed for able-bodied people only, mainly.
Yeah, well, and it is generally for able-bodied people. And realistically, it's a very patriarchal society, right? So women and children are often not seen as a whole. We're still, it's still a huge divide, even though we've come a long way. But there's still lots, that needs to be done. And just kind of finding that balance of what needs to change, but not to the extreme either, right? And which we've seen, and the whole movement of feminism, or the LGBT plus, and how we really need to create safe spaces for people, but not have it at that level of extremity where it takes away from what we're trying to create, that inclusivity of folks that are have challenges, right? And being mindful of are those things that those individuals want as well. So right, we have the folks, the men that kind of support the feminism movement, but they don't really talk to us. They just assume that we want certain things, right? And same with the LGBTQ plus, right? Are we fighting because we think they want those things, or have we talked to them?
Mm-hmm.
So it's finding that balance too, and making sure we're not
The whole nothing about us without us.
yes,
Like
yeah.
alongside.
Yeah, so working
Yeah.
alongside but not taking away from.
Mm-hmm.
And that's too, we've seen those movements happen where they go to the other spectrum, and then it becomes harmful and toxic to what the movement originally was meant for, right? And that's where, inclusivity needs, that it is a huge topic, because where do we become the saviors, which we shouldn't become? And are we doing it for our own gain, or and and is it being impactful to that movement
Right.
of change, right? So we need to really be mindful of those categories.
Right. I know ethicists talk about, is altruism ever truly altruistic?
Yes.
Because there is something that you get, even if you are heartfully giving, selflessly giving and heartfully giving, there is still a return
Yeah.
to you.
Yeah.
And so nothing's ever truly just altruistic. And so what is the motive behind wanting to be an ally, and how do we be a responsible ally?
Yes. Yeah. And that's where we need to educate ourselves and kind of look, in ways, and talk to the individuals that we are supporting, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the biggest key piece is, in my line of work, I always ask my clients, like, one thing I do is I meet them where they're at.
Mm-hmm.
So whether you're ready to move away from addictions or get medication for mental health, like those little pieces, that's their choice. I can't force them to do those things, but I can help support them. And and it's having those conversations with them, like, what are you looking for? What are you wanting? In terms of supports, and how can I can include you into these conversations? Because a lot of times we get where they're not included, and they're like, well, this isn't what I wanted. This isn't what I asked for. So are we doing it for our own selfishness?
Not hearing them.
And not hearing them, or are we, or do we need to kind of stop and say, hey, oh yeah, okay, this is not what you asked for, and kind of move around that narrative, right?
Being able to humble in order to pivot at that point.
Yeah, yeah. So.
And so what I'm hearing you say is, like, it's really key you meet them where they're at, and they're the expert on their own inclusivity of when they feel inclusive.
Yes.
Or not.
And I think another piece of that, like inclusivity, is whether or not they are able to make those choices for themselves too, depending on their mental health. And I think that's a huge topic that we need to be very mindful, and especially when it comes to treatment options. So there is, the talk of forced treatment, and but we have to be mindful that a lot of that stems from mental health. So, years ago we had, psychiatric care hospital that was tertiary, and people could go. It had, I think, almost 1,000 beds, and eventually it was shut down. But we're seeing more and more people who are vulnerable being manipulated. Right? And how do we safeguard those individuals that are in a really vulnerable state, but still give them that autonomy over themselves, right?
It seems like a regression, like in my perspective, because when people were forced into institutions, that was highly traumatizing. And that's part of why we have so much stigma today, because people are so fearful of mental health because of the trauma the collective has gone through going to some of those spaces.
Yeah, and this is where we need to kind of evaluate, like, what is safe, because and kind of do it in a way that is going to be beneficial for those individuals, and especially with residential schools, individuals that may be here and their families have been in the war, right, and they were in concentration camps and stuff. those are key pieces that we have to keep in mind. Those were confined spaces, right? But at the same time, we have individuals that are not safe on the streets as well, right? So how does that piece look to try to keep them safe and still include them in their autonomy, right? So, and we do need something, especially up in the north, right? We have people, you know, dying at daily rates for, you know, for overdose usage and homelessness, and especially in the wintertime when those temperatures drop, right? So it's really trying to find a solution for those individuals when, but yet protecting in a protective way, right? Not creating more harm, not creating more trauma.
So forced treatment isn't ideal, but what's the alternative?
I think, I mean, forced treatment, no, because I mean, not if they're not ready to do treatment, it's not going to work. But I think addressing those mental health pieces first, and kind of creating that safe space for them, and then eventually having them work on the treatment piece, right? And kind of going either on OAT or whatever method of detoxification and stabilization that will work for them, right? And you know, I know that the system works, but it's also we need to be mindful of how that system works, and especially not re-traumatizing, right? When there's so much trauma on the brain already, we don't want to create more trauma, and then those individuals will, you know, eventually use more, right? We want to create that safe space for them, but and still have them say, you know, what's working for them and what's not working for them, what they would like in their treatment plans, you know, having some say, but still having them in a safe environment where they're not being taken advantage of as well.
One of the biggest things I see is as a barrier for people I've supported or walked alongside, people who I love dearly, that have needed multiple kind of services, is the silos, that those services do not connect with one another. And each one has a different protocol. Each one has a different process. Each one has a different set of expectations. They're not in this kind of collaborative space of this human being's journey. So they also don't get the past, present, and future context of where that's even weaving. And then if they have impaired executive functioning, they're expected to redo each process each time. And then, you know, and like you said, the stigma of, well, they just didn't try. Well, no, that's not the case. They're trying.
They and some of them are trying, right? Like, and or they lose, some of them lose hope because they're reopening up their story every time they go to somebody different, right? And that can be re-traumatizing as well. So how do we create that, right, where we have one system platform where we see the supports that they're getting, so that we know that there's that wraparound supports for them, and we are engaging as agencies together, whether and individuals too, right? Like not shutting people out, not shutting unless that person specifically doesn't want those individuals involved, right? Because we have to keep in mind that they also have autonomy. Right. So, you know, it may be a toxic parent that they don't want involved in that. So we have to respect that. We have to respect their boundaries and say, hey, you know what, I hear you. And how can we work to solve this problem? And I think too, it comes down to, you know, like if you think of our medical system, right, we're all like, it's all on different platforms. So one doctor is not necessarily getting the same thing as, you know, the counselor or the psychiatrist, or, you know, so then we're getting, or the social worker that's, you know, working with them, or whoever. And so now you have all these different things. The client themselves or the individual is having to say it over and over and over and over again. Or if they change provinces, you know, they're having to repeat. And so that creates a barrier, a huge barrier for clients.
So we talk about inclusivity of care and services, which helps make society as a whole more inclusive to individuals as well. I'd love to just take a moment to ask you, what does inclusivity mean to you? If you could define it, if you could say this would be a definition that you work from, what would that be?
That everybody has a safe space, and that we as individuals have to look at setting that safe space for people too, in terms of if there is somebody who is, if it's a group setting, for example, and there's a toxic person in that whole group. So it's, and just addressing that with that individual and saying, hey, you're creating an unsafe space. Can we talk about it? Maybe they've had something in their life where they were taught differently, right? We have, Canada is a diverse country. We have people from all walks of life, different religions, different backgrounds, different, my family as well came from Poland. So totally different way of thinking and upbringing. And sometimes it's educating them that that's not safe in this environment, and it's not doing it in a bad way, but it's just kind of saying, hey, this is a safe, inclusive place.
Right.
If this is something that you struggle with, maybe we can address it, or we can educate you more on it, right? And a lot of people are receptive to learning about those things, right? I mean, there's always going to be people that aren't, and you just kind of have to address that. But it's setting those boundaries so that inclusivity is there for people. So for me, yes, like it is creating safe spaces for people. That is what inclusivity is. It's not segregation. It's not, setting, but we do have to be mindful of boundaries.
Yeah, so I mean that's a topic. Like, so if we want to have an inclusive space, but say a person who's being included isn't being safe themselves, what is the balance?
I think it's just addressing it in a safe way, right? Like maybe they were taught differently. Maybe they were, that's part of, what their upbringing. And so just addressing it and saying, hey, like this is not how we handle things. And this is kind of a boundary that we don't cross. And, I think most of the time when you are being kind about it, people take that in a kind way and are able to change that narrative in themselves. And then there's folks that aren't, so you do have to remove that piece, right? So that the rest of the people are able to have that and able to talk. Because if you have one person that is not being receptive to the group, and then nobody's talking, then what does it do for their healing too? So you have to be mindful of those things, and that's where those boundaries come in as well.
I feel like when we hold up a mirror of kindness, or we say, in this space, everyone's included, everyone matters, including you, it can bring up stuff, that realization and mirror, that becomes the inner work, hey?
Yeah,
and if that aspect that maybe when they experience something other than kind could be a lot for them, if they haven't taken that time to go, oh, wait a minute, that's not normal what I went through.
Yeah, and I think that's where that self-reflection comes in, right? Like and that's where you bring it up in a kind way, they are going to reflect back on those things and realize, like you said, like, oh, that wasn't normal. Like those weren't those are not normal pieces of my childhood. That
people with high trauma would struggle with it more, though. I think it would surface a lot, and they may take some time.
Yes, yeah, and that's okay. Like it's still creating a safe place for them as well.
Right.
Whether you do one-on-one with them and say, hey, like this is maybe the group setting isn't a good fit for you right now, and then but you still create a safe space for them,
Yeah.
right? So you're not excluding them from,
Mhm.
you know, whatever is the issue. You're still making sure that they have a safe place,
Yeah.
in order to be able to connect with themselves, right? And connect with their past and connect with all those things that maybe are internal that they have never realized before, right? So it's you're setting boundaries, but still not discluding them, right? So
Right.
and still allowing them to have that safe place to talk and bring up, the things that they've dealt with. And
If they can regulate. So there's times when there's people who can't regulate because it's a lot. They'll go to their coping or their defense mechanisms.
yeah.
Which are
And
those
that's something.
external behaviors that we can witness often.
Yes,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah.
So, and that's something we see, like, especially with, um, individuals that are in the downtown core. A lot of times it is the fact that they have learned ways of coping, and it may not be the right way, but that's all they know, right?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Okay, so these are Cards Against Inequity, and they were made by the Canadian Nurses Unit. So here's a card. These are discussion cards for equity, and it says, "What does inclusion look like?" And it shows these kind of different things. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I honestly think that this is a really good example of what inclusion should look like. Especially with, you have all the individuals and it's a safe place. The exclusion of, the individuals on the outside, while we have, the main categories of people that, are kind of a tight-knit, close group. We have the segregation, which is something, especially with Indigenous people, that we saw, for years, with residential schools, forcing people into their reservations, right? Like, and they were forced to stay there, right? Like, they weren't allowed in mainstream society. It was the same with Black folks up until what, 1980, whatever, right? Like, I mean, even
Sitting at the back of the bus.
sitting at like, there's
Segregation.
the segregation piece is huge in our society, and there's still a lot of that, like in countries that, especially with men and women are segregated from men. They're not allowed to wear certain clothing, right? Like, so we're still dealing, like, this isn't a new thing, right? Like, it's still present today. And so it's something we need to still address, right? And then, our integration piece, well,
How would you explain that one?
This is interesting because that integration is like that core group of people that are trying to keep themselves safe, yet you have the outside world. And I think a good factor of that would be especially the LGBTQ plus, right? They're trying to integrate themselves into society, and they've done a great job of it, but then you're gonna always have those individuals that are kind of leery, right? Like, and so how do we help balance that piece, right? So that we create this inclusion piece.
The other thing I think of is when I'm told about how oftentimes immigrant families, they will only stay with the people who are from the same space as them and the same ethnic background as them and culture as them and eat the same food. And so they're in the city, but they're only interacting with one another. So that integration piece, but that's by choice. What is it, always by choice, do you think? Or
I don't think it's necessarily by choice. I think it's what is safe and comfortable. And I think that, right, like, that's why people kind of migrate towards their own culture or their own, right? Because they don't, they come to a new place and they don't know anything different. And a lot of times too, like, when you're coming here, you grew up in a very vastly different country, and then it's culture shock, right? So then they kind of form this, you know, they bond to what they're used to, what they're familiar with.
Mm.
And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but
It's
eventually
a response.
it is a response. Yeah. Like it,
Mhm.
and I mean, a lot of individuals do eventually become included in other parts of culture and stuff like that. But I think in the beginning, yeah, a lot of folks, and you see that too with the, um, the downtown core. People kind of tend to keep to themselves, and that's that integration piece,
Yeah.
right?
And
And
also
exclusion, yeah, or segregation, right? Like when
Mhm.
they were kind of all being forced out to Moccasin
Yeah.
Flats. That's not ideal for all of them, right? Because some of them didn't feel safe being there. So that segregation piece of forcing all of them to be in that spot and then trying to get them out of there, right? Like, and it's just like, so you're doing this push and pull scenario with them, which isn't fair to them either.
So I like the word autonomy you were using in reference before about people's autonomy over their care and who's offering them their care and services. And I think autonomy is also important here. So like the integration one, if they're choosing that, then that's what they want.
Yeah, and that's why I said, it's not
Yeah.
necessarily a wrong
Yeah.
response because that they're going to go where they are familiar. And it's not that they're not trying to integrate themselves, but like I said, there's so many factors into why they're
Yeah.
doing those things, right? And so is it a wrong response? No. Is it something that they're comfortable doing? Yes, right? And so you can't, and we see that even with individuals down in the downtown core. They have their core group that they stick to because it's safe, and they protect each other, and it's what's familiar for them. And
Yeah.
so, is it a wrong response? No, because they've created that bond of a family together, right? So, can we fault them for that? And if they get and this is something that we've found is that they want to, and this is where that inclusion piece, they get housing, but their friends don't. So, and they want to make sure their friends are included as well, right? Which is a beautiful thing, I think, in itself, because it shows that they're making sure that those other individuals are safe too.
This is a great discussion card. Something else that comes up for me with this discussion is the idea of inclusion and honoring the diversity, though. So it's not necessarily about be part of the whole and be like the dominant, like become amalgamated with us, because that was really the efforts made through residential schools and colonization.
Yeah.
Right? It was take the Indian out of the child, was what Johnny MacDonald said, and that was what was wanted. So it would have been, oh, come and be included with us, and everyone would be green then.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is not what we want. So when we see color, we see the diversity and inclusion woven together. So we're honoring the unique attributes of each people.
Yeah, and I mean, we are only human, right? So we all have bones and muscle and we all have eyes and ears, and we're no different than each other. And yes, somebody might be blind, or somebody might be deaf, or somebody might, have brown skin, somebody might have white skin, somebody may, be from a different culture, but we're all humans at the end of the day. We all bleed the same. So what makes that person any different than who I am as a person?
So that's inclusivity as the whole, and then the uniqueness of each. And it's like, it's not black and white. It's not one or the other. It's both at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's the paradigm shift, I feel.
And that's something that, we're not superior to anybody. We're, it doesn't matter if our education is way up here or down here, right? A lot of the individuals that are considered low functioning have a lot to say and have a lot to teach us. And I don't think that we should take away from that. I mean, there was institutions for Down syndrome, and
Hmm.
those individuals are quite smart. They're different, but they have their own uniqueness. So why should we take that away from them, right? Or make them feel incapable of doing things? We're all capable of doing things if we're taught, and everybody is able to do whatever it is if they put their mind to it, right? So a lot of these individuals are, there's people down on the streets that are beautiful work, mechanical, like they do all these things that, given the opportunity, they could do them in real life environments, but they're not given those opportunities. So that's where that exclusion happens, right?
Yeah.
And or somebody that made a mistake, and now has a record, and it was a one-time mistake, and now they can't get work, right?
Or housing.
Or housing, right? Or somebody with severe PTSD because they were in the war, and they're still struggling with that trauma piece, or they have night terrors, or and just those things, right? So let's look at the bigger picture and kind of try to mitigate some of that exclusion, right? And start making sure people are being included.
So you're a huge advocate for the unhoused, and is that how it is proper to say a reference to those without homes, like
I mean,
unhoused peoples,
some of them will,
homeless people?
yeah. So some people say homeless, but or they'll call themselves homeless. But I mean, at the end of the day, they're unhoused, right? Like so and I mean, BC in itself has become, really hard to find housing that is affordable for them. And, even with the services provided, you have to meet a certain criteria. So if you don't meet that criteria, right? So then again, now you're excluded. And so how do we fix that, right? Or if they have mental health issues and they can't sustain a place of themselves and they're constantly getting kicked out, then they're kind of red flagged, right?
Yeah.
So there's so many factors. And this is where, again, that care and forced, and like, I don't agree with necessarily the forced treatment, but forced mental health care to address some of those issues. But again, being mindful of who those individuals would be and assuring that they have autonomy as well. And that those, and ensuring that, that they have a say in what their care plan would be, so that it's not a scary process for them to go through. Yes, they need this addressed, but at the same time, let them have some say in what they're, not even some say, but figure out what they feel is going to work for them.
Human dignity and respect.
Yeah, not taking it away completely from them, but realize, but also saying, hey, like right now you need to be cared for.
Yeah.
And kind of having those discussions with them instead of like, you're crazy, you need to go, into this institution, because that's not what it's about. We want to make sure you're kept safe. But how would you like that model to look for you?
Yeah.
Right. So being mindful of those pieces.
You talk about providing care without all of these these hurdles that they have to go through. And I talk to doctors who've moved to Canada and moved to BC to provide care. And they share with me, like, where they are doctors, where they are used to practicing medicine, they do not have all of these things that they expect people to go through in order to just get care. Like, people just get care. And that's what I find baffling. And same with mental health, same with people who need community so much and need inclusion and need safe spaces and just need human love and connection.
And that's where that shift needs to happen.
It does.
Because it's not what is happening especially in Canada or even the United States, it's not working.
Mm-mm.
Right? And then we're burning out at a rate that is so fast, and people aren't wanting to return to work because it becomes too hard.
Mm-hmm.
And that burnout is just, you take some time off work, but then you go back and that burnout happens like a lot quicker than before. So yeah, you're right. Like we do need to shift that paradigm and say, hey, this isn't working. What do we need to change? And that was actually a conversation. So the mental health and substance use conference was just the last couple days, and that was a conversation that was brought up in those conversations with networking. How do we change that narrative, and how do we start implementing it, sooner rather than later? Because we are all seeing it, and we're all kind of realizing that these shifts need to happen. But then you have some individuals that aren't on board with it, right? So they think that the system is fine as it is.
Yeah.
But it's not.
It's the old paradigm. It's a colonial paradigm. It's a paradigm
Yes.
that's quite disconnected. Shut down your emotion. There's a reason human emotions, we became normalized to shut that down. Well, workers aren't robots either.
No.
We are not meant to be these systematic robots going, we provide care. And if somebody is in a crisis, our ancestors, like anywhere else, through all time and space, you would just show up and they would be there.
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be tick these boxes and then we'll order lunch and we'll plan that and we'll order this and we'll do it all around kind of this targeted agenda.
Yeah.
And it's become that, and it doesn't need to be. That's a choice.
No, and that, no, it is a choice, right? Like it's a huge choice to force people into this perfect box. But there is no perfect box, and we have to remember that, right?
So I was a youth in Prince George. I was on a youth agreement. I fell through every box or category that was put in front of me by multiple agencies. And had I would have become a statistic.
Yep.
But for whatever reason, I chose to outsource, and through, and that's why I studied as rigorously as I did about everything that it comes down to with like social wellness and equity.
When you are not given those opportunities and you're falling through the cracks time and time again, and when the system is broken, but yet, people are blaming the individuals. It's not the individual's fault. There's a majority of them don't start off as homeless or addicted to drugs. That's not how it starts, but there's that narrative that's, and people push that narrative, but that's not the truth. A lot of these people have severe trauma or mental health issues, or passed down, as we know, the generational trauma. And so there was dysfunction in the families, and that's what they know. And then they themselves are dealing with that trauma that has been passed down to them. And how do we shift that dynamic? I can say that, in a lot of families, with residential schools, or even after the wars, we have so many individuals that are still facing that trauma to this day. I see it in my own family. My own grandmother, and family members so both sides of my family all came from Poland. My great grandmother was murdered by the Bandera in Ukraine. My other grandmother was in concentration camps. Like, those are all pieces of trauma that were passed down. I see it in my parents. And I didn't understand it as a child or as a youth, and as you get older, and especially with all this information coming out regarding generational trauma and how the trauma impacts later generations. And that's where that whole catalyst of, we need to be the change of that, those generational pieces. And it's true, we do.
We're cycle breakers.
Yeah, and that, when I see myself doing something that was reflective of what my parents did, I have to take a step back and say, hey, I need to address this. Why am I doing this? And so that it doesn't affect my own children, because that's the cycle we need to break.
Yeah.
Right? But this is all new. It's not, I mean, mental health is really only been around for about 100 years, 150, right? Like it's neuroscience in itself is just, in a spectrum is like the universe. We still have so much unknown in that dynamic of what's gonna, like what we're gonna still uncover.
I really like decolonizing mental health as a topic, and so when I think about what decolonizing mental health is, you brought up standardization, right? If we have a standardization, that is a cultural choice, that is a social values choice, that is, we are choosing what is standard as a society. So that's not necessarily black and white fact.
No.
And so when people are born and then they're not within that standard, they become a label.
Yes.
They become a disorder.
Yeah.
And so it's a Western model way of knowing.
Yes.
And if we think, oh, is that mother being supported, or like while she's raising her child? Well, that she's having a natural response if she has postpartum depression.
And and that comes to how many kids are taken away because the support's not there, right? Or a child maybe has severe ADHD and severe autism, and there's no respite care. And then that child is taken away because that mother is not supported.
Yeah.
So
which is
the
not
inclusion, no, it's not, because back in the day, it was a community of people.
For all cultures.
For all cultures. Where the colonization, even started and that segregation happened, stemmed from years of, war and and the patriarchy. Like it really stems down from what the patriarchy felt was appropriate. And then so we need to kind of break down those barriers and put community back into play, and not thinking we can do it all on our own, because we can't. Like it's never been meant in any culture that we do things on our own. We always have family supported and community support, and that's what's missing. It's a huge key piece of what's
individualism missing. Because if we are all living in our own homes, we're all buying our own home, having a mortgage, right? Having the all-American dream, the 2 cars, right? Individualism, I mean, we spend more money then.
Yes.
Because we're a capitalistic society, a consumer culture.
Yeah.
So do consumer cultures value and honor people staying at home and nurturing their children, like throughout their children's lives?
They don't. And it's and that's where a lot of kids are falling through the cracks, and then they end up those statistics, right? Is because we have, and I'm somebody, I love working and being a mother. So, but
yeah, not trying to guilt moms in this session.
No, but at the same time, is it harder? Yes.
Yeah.
And as a single parent, is it harder? Even more so? Yes. But at the same time, that's a choice that I made to work and, provide for my kids in a way that I can. And was it difficult? Yes. Did my kids, at times suffer for it? Absolutely. So it's like, where does that change have to happen so that parents are able to care for their kids?
Yeah. Right? It's impossible with bills.
It is. And in today's society, it is impossible. Both parents have to be working, or at least, if the one parent stays home, like the other parent has to be, working all the time. So either way, one parent is always missing out on something.
Within that segment of society, if they're low-income earners, then there could be low-income housing and different strategies.
Yeah, but and those pieces of, we're still working, and this is the problem too, is that, it has to be under a certain amount of money that you're making that you get these supports serviced to you. But then a lot of people are falling through the cracks because they make just above that and they're struggling and they're working paycheck to paycheck. And so that's, to me, is a barrier and not inclusive to, the wages that are not increasing with the standard of what the living expenses have increased. And so there's lots of work to be done in terms of that to help support people, right? We're not living in an inclusive society.
No.
And that is a reality that we need to address realistically, right? Because the more and more we don't address this, the further behind people are going to get, and we're just going to start seeing more of those individuals falling through cracks.
So I do feel it comes down to love and connection, but that's just like, that's the summation of all the complexities. And so it's so hard to bring that into the fabric of, these systemic policies. And, it comes down to love and connection, like the 60s, but it really does on a neuroscience level, on, an anthropological level, on, just a sane level. What is the alternative, right? It's actually insane to continue with disconnection and the opposite of love or anything other than love.
Yeah. But like, it's not, it's, yes, people will associate it with the 60s and peace and love, but really that is what is needed, right? Like we're in a modern world and there's still like wars going on that realistically we should not be having. But here we are, right? And there's people being affected by it. And families that are being affected by it on a regular basis, and that's not fair, right? And I'm not saying like we can't have love and shining, unicorns.
It's not utopia.
It's a utopia, and we have to have the balance of good and bad, so that we appreciate the good. But at the same time, like when people are so set on having this hatred and segregation of individuals because of where they came from, or who they are as individuals, because they fell through the gaps, that narrative needs to change, right? And have some kind of empathy and just understanding. Try to understand what that person possibly may have gone through, because we don't know their stories unless they come to us and say, this is my story. And some of them, it's so traumatic that they don't talk about those stories because it's so hard for them, right? So they internalize all of that
and shut down their nervous system.
So
in a constant freeze.
So it's not necessarily that they chose this life. And majority of them don't choose this, or all of them don't choose that life. It's not a life they want or choose. They're stuck, right? They're stuck in that.
Absolutely.
So
when I think of love and connection in our society, I think of the fact that we're co-regulative beings. We're co-regulative mammals. So our nervous systems, in order to be online, to be on, we need to feel safe. We need to feel like it's loving to have connection. And, I think that really is key to us coming into what we would know as a well society, being a healthy society. Because at this point, we are not a well society.
No. And I think too, we're seeing more and more of the that anxiety piece, especially after, I mean, realistically, when COVID shut everything down, a lot of our kids got affected by that. And we did too, right? And so that created a really harmful experience for people in their mental health. Did it need to happen to safeguard people as well? Yes. Like, it's that topic that nobody really wants to talk about, right? And it's unfortunate because it's so hard, whether, and people still struggle talking about it. But that mental health piece really harbored, and how could we do that differently so that kids aren't being affected that same way, right? Especially if we ever did have to have another shutdown or lockdowns, right? Like, and how would that impact our mental health again, and especially the younger generations. We kind of almost need to have, circles of people that are allowed to see each other, right? Or certain things like that need to change so that we're still being safe, but not creating this huge divide either, right?
So I have a question in your expertise. When we talk about inclusivity, what if those spaces that are the option to be included to aren't safe spaces? What if, they're dysregulated spaces, or they're spaces where people are staying in their trauma armor, like I call it trauma, but they're staying in that kind of rigidity with one another, so they're not having healthy kind of discourse. What do you do then?
I mean, really, you have to allow them the space to come freely, right? So if they're stuck in that trauma, it's meeting them where they're at and creating a safe place for them, as opposed to forcing them into a group or
what if the dominant whole, like what if the whole
Yeah.
community is dysregulated and unwell and maybe not the safest space? So how, like, for them, inclusion would then be not safe for them.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, and that's something that is very common in some reserves, right? Especially the really remote reserves where there's that dysregulation of trauma. And so it's really kind of trying to break that down in a individual way, or possibly sending them somewhere where they might be safer, right? So it's just finding what is going to work for certain individuals and trying to create a safer place in that community. Like, is that what you're kind of?
I don't know.
Okay. I was like,
I know that a lot of people
yeah,
go to urban centers because it's bigger and they feel safer in a larger center.
Yes, and that is something that we usually do, right? Like we take them out of those smaller communities that might not be fitting for them, and then kind of bringing them into a bigger area and then working with them either one-on-one or in a group setting with other individuals that have worked on their trauma, and then kind of allowing them, because sometimes too, when they're surrounded by that disconnect and that trauma, that's all they know, right? So kind of removing them from that for, it doesn't have to be, a long time, like forever, but just even like a year, and kind of having them work through that, right? And taking some of those individuals out of that and separating them from, right? So sometimes that separation needs to happen, and that's where that those boundaries need to also happen, right, for individuals. And sometimes it's having those conversations like, hey, are you setting this boundary for yourself? And maybe this is a boundary that you need. Again, it's giving them autonomy.
Yeah.
Right? Like it
has to be.
Yeah, so you're giving them the conversation, you're giving them some of those tools and kind of addressing what might need to change so that they can work on themselves, right? And kind of piecing all of that together for them.
Well, that crabs in the bucket thing is often the most pervasive.
Yeah.
Especially when someone's on a new healthy journey, to bring it, if they aren't coming into a new space, they can get pulled back in.
Yeah, and too, it's that their past. So when they do go back to sometimes their communities, their past is being judged because of things that they've done in the past, when they have changed and they're trying to create a new space for themselves, and they are trying to, right? But then they're being excluded because they, of what they have done in the past. So
It is so important to see people as they present now and
Yeah.
in their new self, because that's that whole hero's journey, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey.
Yeah.
And if you come back and you come to share your story and people just see you as though you're the person that you were 10 years ago, the power of their perception is actually quite strong.
Yeah. Well, and it's so hard because this person has done all the work to, better themselves or, create themselves to, work on that journey. And it takes one person's opinion
Yeah.
to shatter that.
Yeah.
And that individual has worked so hard
Yeah.
to turn their lives around.
Communities genuinely have a powerful role and in community wellness and in embracing and recognizing and valuing the hero's journey, like that people go on.
Yeah.
Doing the work.
And there is some amazing communities that, I've worked with, and I think, and that is something that they, when somebody goes on that journey and they do make changes, the whole community comes together and really supports that person. And I think that's so powerful because it shows the power that we have over what we think and say is really, impactful of that person's journey and how much they are going to survive. So if we're going to, consistently call people, on the streets or the unhoused or, people with mental health and addiction issues, if we're going to call them scum or we're going to call them or treat them and walk by them and, not connect with them or kick them, there's people that walk past these individuals and will kick them or just, right? Yeah, it happens. But it's so disturbing because then those people are going to continue to feel worthless. When you walk past those individuals and make them feel that way, that is how they're going to constantly perceive themselves.
Yeah.
But if you change that narrative and just say hi to them, acknowledge them as a human being, what is that going to do for them? Right? Just saying hi. It takes nothing to be kind.
Everyone has so much power in their words, in their thoughts.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Their actions.
Yeah. So just, you don't have to do anything, but just say hi. Be kind. Right? And we don't need to have that, give them anything other than a smile. Right? It changes then how they see themselves.
Because we're co-regulative beings, people can feel when someone is just carrying the notion of you matter.
Yeah.
You are worthy.
Yeah.
You are lovable. You are human.
Yeah. Because each individual out there is somebody's parent, somebody's child, somebody's grandfather, grandmother, mother, father. They are somebody.
The essence of a healthy community is the ability to have compassion.
Yeah.
If we don't have that, we're not healthy.
And that's where we're seeing those divides, right? And that shift again needs to change. So how do we change it? And how do we bring, and that's how do we change that model and implement it in a way that's going to be impactful to our communities, to not just the larger centers, because that's the biggest problem, is that everything is so focused on these larger communities. But what about our smaller communities, and how is that going to help them? And how do they want that model to look too, right, for their communities? So that's something that we all need to kind of, and that's where these discussions need to happen, right? We need to start looking at, especially our rural communities that are affected by so much of, and those changes that happen for them but don't work because it's, a model that is meant for a large city. So those are conversations we do need to have.
So this card says, what is a safe space? And it says a place or environment in which a person or category of people can feel confident that they will not be exposed to discrimination, criticism, harassment, or any other emotional or physical harm.
Yeah.
One thing with cultural safety work I know is that it's always talked about, you know, a space isn't safe unless that person says, I feel safe. It's the person themselves.
And that's where, yeah, we need to respect autonomy of people, right? If they don't feel safe in a space, then we have to respect that.
And if they share that, then start to investigate, like,
yeah,
you know, why, what could be, and don't gaslight, that's for sure.
No, and that's the thing is, like, you know, myself, like, there's times where I've made mistakes, but it gets addressed, and I'm like, oh, whoa, like, totally did not mean that. But then you're like,
yeah,
okay, let me change that narrative and make sure I don't make that mistake again, so that that person doesn't feel unsafe in my presence, because that to me means more than anything. I want to make sure people feel safe around me. But I will also, for myself, set boundaries if I feel unsafe, right? So that's another key piece. We need to make sure that we are protecting ourselves from safe, you know, like
as well.
Yeah, right?
Yeah.
So, because I mean, if we're not healthy, we can't be healthy for other people either. So.
Yeah, safe spaces for provider and client.
Yes, yeah.
And also employer, you know, it just, I think about how you say, you know, I can make a mistake and I'll own that mistake.
Yes.
Well, you know, is it safe for you as a leader or as a representative or as somebody who works for someone? Is it safe for you to make mistakes? Will that employer treat you with respect and all of these things? No criticism for that or other kinds of harm.
Yeah.
You know, how can we facilitate making safe spaces for all people to make mistakes?
And I think that's something that is slightly changing in employers, like where they're realizing like it's okay for people to make mistakes and they need to learn from it. And you know, for myself, like if I'm showing somebody something and you know, and they're new or you know, they're going to make mistakes, but how do you address that in a positive way, right? You don't want that person to feel afraid of coming to you and being, and I've had, you know, employers that have been like that, where I didn't feel safe going to that person, or, you know, I was so scared that I had messed up. And, you know, and I'm a fairly like to the T person. So, and, you know, I have to have everything a certain way and da da da, right? So I'm hard on myself already. So to have, and most of people are, right? Most people are harder
because of our cultural conditioning.
Yes, and that is something that we need to recognize, that it's okay to make mistakes
and to not know.
And to not know, and that's the thing, is that, you know, we don't know everything. We have so many things to learn in our lifetime that we are never going to know everything. You know, I mean, there's very few people that know everything, and even they themselves probably don't know everything.
And the people who say they know everything, they know the least, because once you know enough, you know that you don't know.
Yeah.
So once you reach the point of knowing that you don't know, then you're like, okay, I know a bit.
Yes.
It's a very ironic.
Yes.
But I think, you know, when you say a new person's going to make mistakes, but also senior leadership is going to make mistakes.
And that's just...
And their ability to be humble and to move through a space that's needed will move our trajectory along so much faster and better.
Yeah. And it shows that we're not impervious to failure.
No. Well, where did that fear come from? Like that fear came from a Western norms of existence.
I was just going to say it's a Western way of thinking, right? Like it's a very Western way of thinking. And that's too, like, where we need to focus on learning from those mistakes rather than being hard on ourselves on what those mistakes were. And that boils down to, as well, supporting somebody who, you know, has changed their life around. And, you know, what happened in the past is what happened in the past. Yes, have boundaries with that person. Like there's still, you know, innate fear of that, you know, if they stole from you or something like that. Like you're not gonna just have things laying around that you might, right? Like people are going to have, but you're gonna be kind to them. You're gonna be trusting. in to a certain extent, right? Like there's, but not call them down and tell them that they're worthless. And so, like I said, we have boundaries, but we also have to respect that they've made a shift as well. And sorry, I keep,
It's okay.
and how that shift is going to happen, right? So, and eventually they're going to show you that they're safe to be around. You're safe to leave stuff around, right? Like, so you have to be understanding and allow them that space to be able to be the new person that they have become and worked hard to become, right? So it's kind of finding that balance and allowing them to feel supported.
Thanks. Well, you're a social change leader with lots of wisdom. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you.
And part of this. So I'm really curious, what got you interested in, inclusivity as a topic? Like, why does it matter to you? What's your story there?
I think it boils down to, I watched my cousin. My cousins are Indigenous, and I'm quite a bit older than them, and I watched, especially my middle cousin, and she really struggled because her two siblings are quite a bit darker than she is, and she's kind of more the paler. And I've watched her throughout this journey of self-doubt and, discrimination and not feeling included in so much in the Indigenous community, but not fully white, right? And not feeling wanted in those regards. And for me, I see that in so many individuals. And why should that change for them? Right? Why shouldn't they feel loved and cared for? Right? And I saw her go down that path of her mental health and addictions. And I also saw it in my own family, the addictions piece. And I think for me, if it wasn't for, family and stuff, they too could end up being those people that are on the streets. And they have. So, but I mean, we were able to pull them out of that. But it's not as easy or as black and white as people think it is. And, and I think I want people to understand that. And that's why I fell in, I really fell into this line of work because I am so passionate about changing that narrative and really having people understand. And just that education piece, right? Having people educated, not demanding that they understand, but just saying, hey, this isn't, this perspective isn't fully accurate of what you're painting, right? And maybe having, changing the opinion of one or two people is going to be more profound than not saying anything.
Yeah.
So
for social change leaders and other leaders and service providers in the community and nearby community and other folks who may be tuning in, what kind of wisdom would you want them to glean from anything else that you want to say around inclusivity?
Just be mindful. Just be mindful and aware all the time, right? Like, and not, and if you make a mistake, it's going to happen. And we're, but just address it and change it. And, we're here to learn. We're here to, make changes, not just expecting other people to change, but we as individuals also need to reflect and change too. So it could be doing small things, it could be volunteering, it could be whatever you're capable of, but don't ever hold your own mental health above and what's needed, right? Because I think there's so many people that want to help, but then kind of help, they do too much and then end up burning themselves out.
The wounded healer.
The wounded healer, yes. Yeah.
I like how you say be mindful. It makes me think of, there was a sociologist I did some extensive training with at the BAMP Center during a leadership diploma, and he talked about slow down thinking being the huge, key component for social change that's needed for the next however many generations. Slow down thinking.
Yeah.
And I think of decolonizing the mind when I think of that, like slowing it down, going, why do I believe that? Where did that come from? What is that internalized belief? Was that socialized through me through North American history and what I was told from family? Where did that come from? Was that from my own generational trauma? Where does that belief come from? Why am I so vested and invested in that belief? Yeah. And actually tracking it, like actually doing that work, or slowing down how you respond, and can you bring loving kindness there? I mean, that's a whole practice. But when you say mindfulness, I think of all of that.
Yeah. And that really is what sums it up, right? Mm-hmm. Like it is, being, that comprehensive of slowing your mind down and kind of rethinking kind of those and opening up ourselves in a way that is vulnerable, because I think that there's so many of us that have and it is something that we were taught, we don't talk about these things, we don't, right? And there's still so much of that people think that we need to hold on to those family secrets and the family trauma and that, like, all those pieces that shouldn't be talked about. And you're like, why am I holding on to this? Right? Like, and you're like, but it's so bad to our mental health to hold on to all those things. And especially when we need to talk about it. We are.
It's like water. It's a flowing river. It has that aerated water that's healthy and clear. And when it stagnates, it gets all bubbly and
muddy and
it's the same. Our emotions are the same.
And so we need to discuss these things and make it more. And I mean, that's, the talk about mental health, and, we're starting to include more of those pieces, and, especially like men's mental health and, postpartum depression. I mean, we're finally studying the female body, like those, right? Like, I mean, that's a huge piece of inclusivity that, wasn't around for years, right? Like, we don't know like anything.
I recently got diagnosed with POTS, and so POTS is very much with females. And because POTS all of a sudden sprung up from COVID, because it can be virus induced.
Yeah.
Now all of a sudden it's impacting males, so it's all of a sudden researched. But POTS was around for decades, but it mostly affected females.
Yeah.
So it was under researched.
Yes. Yeah. And that's the thing, is that, like, even women's health in general, like even their basic fundamentals, like their uterus was not really studied, right? So this is like all things that, is unfamiliar territory, and they're kind of realizing, like, oh crap, like, same with men's mental health, right? Like, that was something, women were considered hysterical for how many generations, right?
Lunatic is actually a word from
derived from
Luna, from women and dancing around the moon and their moon time.
Yes,
that they were lunatics.
Yeah, and yet it's, now we have PMDD, right? Like, so, and that was actually, it's not that we're lunatics, but we literally, our hormones go through such a shift, and some women are affected more than others, right? Yeah. And, same with menstrual pain, right? Like, those are things that we're still...
But it's powerful. And so, oftentimes menstrual pain is connected to, again, withholding emotion.
Yes.
Because as soon as, I've worked with women before, and I work with women in women's circles and things like that. I love the sacred art of women's healing.
Yeah.
And when they are connecting to themselves authentically, and they care and they love themselves, and they're willing to move what's real for them through, their menstrual pains stop.
Yeah. And it's the same for men too, right? And men's healing. Because, and this is where that inclusivity, right? Us as women have that need for a supportive male figure, and men need that nurturing women figure. And that's, where that whole healing process needs to happen. We're not impervious to one or the other. We need to heal those traumas so that we are able to cohabitate in a peaceful way, and not be shut down, right? And, men have, for generations been told they have to be strong and can't cry and do all these things, right? And women are supposed to be the nurturing and, all these pieces, but sometimes we're not. And it stems down from that trauma piece. And men are allowed to cry. Men are allowed, like, it's healing. It's and that's where, we need to work together and work on healing and getting all those things like out, and create a beautiful space for our future generations, right? And not have it so colonized either. And that's,
Well, we can't shun each other for doing that work, because if people are doing that work, that's highly commendable. That is hard work, and it's what we need to do to have a healthy society. Don't shun each other and keep each other shut down.
No.
Like, if that's the one thing I could ever send that message out, is to let people do and be what they need to.
Yeah. Let them express themselves in healthy ways. And and that's the key piece, is healthy.
And it's gonna get messier before it's this, like, what that conservative colonial standard, which came from Victorian era of being polished and perfect and put together, that's still required sometimes in some spaces.
Yes.
But we actually will need to get messy before we can become a more healed society.
Yeah. And I mean, bring on the mess.
Yes.
If that's what's going to cause the healing, then bring on the mess, because that's what we need, right?
100%.
And we're forever going through bouts of trauma, and right, so it's a never-ending process. And it's interesting. My son, he had a guest dance teacher for his intensive, and he actually told the kids, he said everybody should go to counseling, because he said that it undoes. He's like, and I agree with him.
Yeah, it's like changing the oil on your car. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah, like, we all need to go through counseling. And it doesn't matter, because there's certain things that may seem insignificant in our lives in that moment, but years down the road, it is something that comes up.
Well, and in a Western culture, if, say, kids are going through a lot, whether it's a divorce, their pet dies, there are things that store in the body and can't be processed because there isn't time to. Then we skirt our kids off to school, where now they're being told to pay attention, right? And then they have their extracurricular activities. When do they have time to process what they need to? So it comes up in adulthood.
Yeah. Well, and that's just it, right? Like, it may seem, insignificant in that moment for them, or even for the parent, like, we're like, okay, like, whatever, but then no, it's actually a big deal, and then now they haven't dealt with that. And I thought, that's awesome for that kid to, I mean, he's like, I don't know how old he is, but for him to tell these kids that, right, that, to do counseling.
I love that.
Because I'm like, normalize it. I think that's so important.
Yeah.
We need to normalize that people are going to constantly need a safe place to go and talk and be able to get those things out. Because nobody is going to go through life without trauma. We have death, we have, I mean, death is a part of life, but some people really struggle with it. So, that's why there is grief groups. There is, the grief counseling, and there's, we're going to have witness things that are traumatic, whether it's a car crash or, somebody getting, beat or whatever, right? Like, those are things that impact the brain.
And then unprocessed trauma from before will often come in couple with the new event that's happened, and then people don't actually deal with and work on their inner work until that crisis moment, until there's a new crisis that then brings it up.
Yeah.
And if we have a safer place, a more inclusive place, well, yeah, you're grieving and you're included here.
Yes.
You're sad and you don't have to have this happy smile on while you're here, and you're included here.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it's part of the human path and journey.
Yeah. And having those constant emotions, like we're in a constant state of emotions. So,
and moving the body is great for that. I love how you brought up dance, because I know that there's things that, because if the trauma stores in the body too, you know, dancing and breathing is free.
Yes, dancing,
accessible,
grounding, like going on hikes and just kind of getting that body movement, going to the body of water. And that's something, you know, key in finding what your safe grounding space is too, right? And where that it's different for everybody. Some people are more drawn to the water, some people are more, you know, to the earth, you know, those little pieces of what is gonna tie into you and your healing, right? So
I love that these self-care things are so much more embedded in the workplace. I've worked in many different capacities, and self-care is just foundational, and it's given as from leaders to their employees, you know, and it's more commonly talked about. And the power of language to have, you know, these terms, even when it comes to, you know, I'm working through this, and having these terms of reference, because that makes it less scary, right?
Well, and it makes it less scary that it is being more talked about. I think that having those discussions and continuing to have these discussions of mental health and how it's affecting people, it needs to be a continuation of conversation. People won't get help if they feel like it's a constant battle to get there.
Yeah.
Right? And or that stigma is kind of surrounding them, because it shouldn't be that, right?
Yeah.
We don't want people, you know, hurting themselves or engaging in behaviors that are not generally them, when all they could have done is said, hey, I need help. And they didn't feel safe enough to do so.
Well, I hope they do after this episode, if they feel inspired to in any way. Thank you so much for your time today and coming on. And I look forward to having you on the panel as well.
Thanks for having me.